Welcome back to The Urban Monk. Pedram here with Catherine Osment talking about God, the G word. A lot of people are off it. A lot of people are spiritual, not religious. A lot of people have left the church in droves. But what does that mean for morality? What does that mean for how we raise our children? What does that mean for our connection to that which is greater if you were to search for or believe in such a thing? Fascinating conversation. I know you're going to enjoy it. I'll see you on the other side.
Yeah.
What kind of journalism were you involved writing in journalism?
Yeah, I've been writing articles and essays for a long time. I've worked at National Geographic Magazine. I have written regularly for Boston Magazine. When I lived in Boston, I write essays about parenting. I write about all sorts of things now as a freelancer.
Great. And for what kind of magazines?
Well, I just published something today in Tricycle Magazine. So there's an excerpt from the book on a secular coming-of-age ceremony. And I just also published a piece in this month's Spirituality and Health. So there's, now that this book is out, I'm sort of going in a new direction. I've been more in just sort of mainstream. I published a piece in the New York Times, Salon, places like that. And now I'm sort of veering more toward the spirituality beat, I guess, with this book.
Great. How's the book doing for you?
It's great. It's really an amazing way to engage with the world, is to have a book. It sort of gives you a way to start a conversation with people that you might not be able to meet. You know, you really get to walk into their meeting or their community, their office, and start chatting with them about this topic. And I found it a fantastic way to connect with people.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You actually opened the book with a scene about this religious ceremony, and it's powerful because it stops you dead in your tracks. I'd love to get into that and see how you got into all this.
Yeah, well, the scene was one where we used to live outside of Boston, and we were in our home one night. It was a Friday night, and my son said, "Mama, come look." And I came to the window, we stood at the window, and there was this beautiful procession coming down the street. I mean, imagine this, a city street, and all these people are walking down at night with candles. And they stop right in front of our house. They're dressed in their, nice clothes, and they have this, it looks like a chariot. It's draped in flowers, and there's a little replica of a baby inside, a little doll wrapped in white. And they sing a prayer back and forth right in front of us, and then proceed into the church, which is across the street from us. My son says, "Mama, what was that?" And I said, "Well, I think it's Good Friday, and that's their religious ritual that they do on every year on Good Friday." And he said, "Why don't we do that?" I said, "Well, we're not Greek Orthodox." And he said, "What are we?" And I just blurted out, "We're nothing," because my husband was raised Jewish, I was raised Christian, but we had never found identity really for our blended family. We'd never found a way to describe what we believed, what we valued. And it was that really crystallizing moment of realizing how badly we had dropped the ball and how I really needed to figure out a better answer for him. And so I started writing my book, and it took me 3 years of research and reporting and really deep reflection, sort of come up with a way to understand not only how to answer my son, but why so many of us are finding ourselves in this place where we can't identify exactly what it is we are. I found all these great answers, and I met really amazing people, and the book ended up being sort of this journey I needed to go on.
How did you start? Did you grow up in a religious faith of any kind?
So my family is very religious in background. All of my relatives are from Arkansas, and my grandmother, who I write about in the book, was deeply religious. She was Presbyterian, and she was, religion was threaded through every part of her life and my mother's life. They went to church, but church also bled into every other day, and all of their community interactions were somehow related. The church was like this foundation that they all kept turning to again and again in good times and bad. And so we would visit, and we moved away from Arkansas. I grew up mostly in Connecticut, but we would visit Arkansas a lot, and I would see that religiosity in my cousins and my grandmother's lives. And I watched it kind of from afar and really was fascinated by it and what it gave them and what it did for them. And then my brothers and I did some Sunday school and some of that. We grew up, we knew the prayers, and I would have called myself a Christian then. But it was really watching my more religious relatives that gave me this sense of what religion really gives people.
So you grew up around a lot of religion, but somehow that transition didn't quite, kind of translate into you becoming religious and identifying as religious. What happened? What, like the young you? I mean, you obviously, you were stewing in that soup, but you didn't walk away saying, "I'm a Presbyterian and I'm a card-carrying church member here."
It's really funny. It didn't stick. And why didn't it? And that's a big question I ask people when I go around the country and meet people. It could be part of it was I was growing up in the 70s. A lot of families were losing their ties to religion. One of the things I learned in my research is that this shift to religious disaffiliation is fairly recent, and it started in the 1990s. A lot of people had really loosened their connection to religion, partly because politics started entering the pulpit, and people did not want to hear, what Jerry Falwell had to say about how to live their lives, or the moral majority. And so a lot of people had this distaste for that. I think my parents were among them. And so they probably weren't they were definitely not as God-fearing as my grandparents. So there's this sort of slow and steady loss that happens, I think, over generations. And so, we went to church sometimes, but I also remember many Sundays where my mother did yoga and meditated and worked in her garden. And so there was some of that already entering into my life in the 70s. And now, of course, I do yoga and like to meditate and work in the garden. But so I think there's sort of, for a lot of people, and you can look at the statistics to back it up, you can see this change over the generations where people start to leave these religious institutions and start to create meaning and community in their own ways. I think that is really partly my story too.
It's interesting because then you have a couple generations away from God-fearing grandparents who are, pretty serious about this stuff. And then you go off, presumably you go to school and you meet a Jewish guy and you get married, right? Is that, so you married someone out of there. Did they throw a fit? Like, this is, old world religions get real serious about those things.
Well, so by that time, my grandparents were no longer living, and my parents are forward thinking enough that they can accept this, someone outside of the faith. I will say we got married in Arkansas, and we had an incredibly secular wedding ceremony. We had, I think someone read 1 Corinthians. That might have been the most religious aspect of it. And some of my relatives left pretty early, and so I don't know why. And it was never out in the open that this was a problem. But, I think increasingly interfaith marriage is on the rise. More and more families are doing it. Sure. And so what happens with that is you realize, so-and-so is marrying a nice Jewish guy, and I really like him, and it's not that big a deal. So I think as interfaith marriage goes up as well as the religiously unaffiliated, you start to see people breaking down those walls of intolerance. So I didn't face that outright. Who knows what was going on behind the scenes and people whispering, but I didn't necessarily feel that. And certainly among my friends, it's really common to marry someone of another faith, of course.
As it should be.
And we'll see, more and more of that, I think, as we go along. We are a pluralistic and increasingly multicultural society.
So you marry a Jewish guy. He comes from a rich religious background as well, where there's lots of faith, there's lots of practice, there's lots of kind of tribalism and all that. And you come from a Presbyterian background, and somehow, somewhere lost in translation, your kids grow up with no religion.
Yeah.
Yet there's something missing.
Yeah. So we think when we get married, we'll do something. We'll raise, and people ask us, as you're about to get married, a lot of people say, well, how are you going to raise the kids? These are sort of that older generation, and they know that this is kind of an issue. And of course, we were naive and thought, it's not an issue. We'll figure it out. We'll become Quakers or something. And then year after year after year, we just never got around to it. I mean, it really was just not something that was a strong enough organizing force in our lives. And I think, in some interfaith couples, the couple will choose one, and maybe even someone will convert. I have a friend who converted to Judaism. But in ours, we canceled each other out. So suddenly we couldn't really find ourselves in either space, either the Christian space or the Jewish space. And so what we ended up doing was blending it all. And, after my son asked that question, we really started to realize we should embrace our past. And so we do the Jewish holidays. We do the Christian holidays in a pretty secular way. We're not super religious about it, obviously. We don't go to a synagogue or a church, but we do it with family and friends. But also exploring, what does it mean to be a non-believer or to be agnostic? What does it mean to be, focus on nature and the here and now and science and all of those things too? So it's sort of become this blend of old and new that is where we find our meaning and community.
Yeah, that's a growing list of people, isn't it? Spiritual, non-religious, what are they called? Nones?
Nuns, the N-O-N-E-S's, because we check none of the above when we're asked our religion.
And so you look at some of the kind of people self-reporting for religion on Facebook and social media. A lot of them say, spiritual, non-religious. So we don't, we don't adhere to all these things, but we believe in something, and it's all over the map, right?
Right.
But that is a growing list of people, and there's something that we would love to have as a common fabric there. And you look at the news. What about morality? What about ethics? What about these wonderful things that held society together with the old world religions? Now that some of that stuff is coming apart, where's the new narrative?
Yeah, that's really, I think, the trick of it all, because I think we're raising our kids to appreciate nature and science and questioning, and they're interested in their Jewish heritage and their Christian heritage. They want to know about those things. But where do we meet with other people? Because if we're all doing our own thing, and there is, statistics to show that more and more people are cobbling together a DIY, do-it-yourself religion or spirituality, if we're all doing that, then where do we meet and where do we come together? For us, it has been in the neighborhood, and it's just been at this very local level of being engaged with working with our local neighborhood club and knowing our neighbors and being very engaged in what's going on and trying to, work with people when there's some kind of community service activity, for example. And other people find it in a lot of other ways. I visited secular humanist communities. I spent a lot of time when I was living in Boston. There's one at the Harvard, it's called the Humanist Hub in Harvard Square. And they do a pretty full program. They have almost every day there, they have something going on where people can come and bind together in values-based community. And I found in a secular Buddhist retreat, I found a group of people who also share these values, but not necessarily belief in God. They don't necessarily need that to drive their morality or their sense of meaning in life, but they do want to come together with other people. And so they find it together in these places, and they're kind of just cropping up, I find, around the country because people do want and need that connection.
It's interesting, and we started this party here in America with, the Puritans and it was a very God-fearing culture. And so religion was, oftentimes the impetus for even coming over to the New World. And so those were kind of the origin stories of a lot of the people who showed up here. And now that that's coming untethered, when you go to these communities, is there a sense of community? Because there was communes in the 70s. There's all kinds of stuff. A lot of weird stuff happened. People think of David Koresh. People think of all sorts of kind of fringe elements that also come with these kind of spiritual communities. But you're talking about communities that are kind of grassroots, growing because people need that all over the country.
Right. Yeah, I think the difference is that there's this emphasis on rational experience, and I can't imagine a David Koresh happening in any of these kinds of places. I mean, these people are really very scientifically minded. It's secular humanism that's one of the sort of founding parts of it, or one of the foundational parts of it, is a belief in science and rationality. But there are studies, and I thought this was really interesting. I write about them in my book, that religious communities have a greater binding power than non-religious communities. There's a study comparing non-religious communes to religious organizations back in the 50s and 60s, and the non-religious ones had a harder time staying together for a longer period of time. And you can see why. I mean, one of the things that secular humanism embraces is disagreement and everyone's speaking their mind, and that individualism. And so it's hard to get people to agree on things and to commit to something. One thing that religion does is ask us to agree on the sacred. This thing is sacred to us, and we will come together every Sunday and worship it. And so I think it can be hard for some of these communities to find that sort of galvanizing power. But I did see some pretty amazing examples of it, and just an urge to really do good in the world and not need God for that, I thought was pretty refreshing.
Yeah, a lot of people galvanized around a constitution that was drafted in this country. And so people say, look, this is the law of the land. And you could say that, we can agree that these things are inalienable human rights. And so, sure, there's some debate and there's some kind of pressure on that. But, and I think you see a lot of this in Europe, right? Like Europe is starting to really become more secular, yet having some sort of kind of common morality that they're trying to bubble up. Is that something that's kind of helping and informing the communities that you've seen here? Or are these kind of coming up on their own?
A lot of secular humanist groups that I talk with, or experts I talk with, they love to cite Scandinavia, which is great because, they have this very peaceful land, but they're a very homogenous land. And so it's a little hard to compare. It's like comparing apples and oranges. But I do think they look to places like Norway that has a thriving secular humanist community. And also Japan, I guess, has this sort of underlying secular humanism as sort of the base of the country. And then the religion kind of gets layered on top as an extra, if you want it. And so it seems that maybe our country is a little bit opposite of that. We've got all this religious stuff going on at the base. And then now these secular humanist communities are trying to come in and say, wait, we want some real estate here. We want to own some of what the religious had dominion over. We talk about morality, and people think you can't be moral if you don't believe in God. Well, of course, that's not true. And so secular humanists are kind of trying to elbow in to the landscape a little bit and say, hey, we're good people too. And I think Europe is a model for that. I think Europe has secularized very slowly over a much longer period of time, and now we're doing it really fast and all of a sudden. And why is that? Why in the past, since 1990, when 7% of Americans said they were religiously unaffiliated, whereas today it's almost 24%. That's not a long period of time. That's happened pretty quickly. And so I guess it'll be interesting to see how we grapple with that, and can we meet somewhere in the middle, because I do think we all are after the same thing, whether we believe in God or not. And so where can we find common ground? And I think other countries maybe do that better than we do.
Well, and they also had a history of religious wars and things that lasted for a long time, right? And so this is, the inception of this country was kind of a new thing. It was a new experiment. And it's hard, right, to have a rational secular argument around absolute truths with people who will not, kind of concede that maybe someone else's morality might also be moral. And so, it creates an environment where there's a bit of a, kind of charge. And so, quick question here, just to kind of set the stage. Do you believe in God?
So I'm an agnostic, and I think there may be a God, but I've come to the conclusion, at least for now, that my brain may not be able to conceptualize it. And so I'm this human being here on earth, and I can't know. I can't know one way or the other if there's a God. And so I live as if that's something I may find out someday, but I'm really going to focus on here and now, and other people in my lives and the world around me, but not with thoughts of heaven or God or salvation coming in the end.
Now, does that put you in a position where you might have more spiritual angst and less of a kind of a comfort narrative in your day-to-day, or does that open you up to other things?
It used to bother me, and I think part of my journey of writing this book was figuring out, how do you have meaning if you no longer feel you're part of God's plan? If you sort of lose that purpose, that you were part of a divine plan and everything has meaning and there's a reason for everything. When that's gone, I really wrestled with how does your life matter? And I came to the conclusion that, and for me, spirituality was even a tricky term because it felt so vague and nebulous. I never really knew what it meant. And I came to realize that spirituality is really just about connection, and that connection in the very moment that we are living and breathing is where I find meaning. I sink down into that. And so it really is almost a physical thing. It's in the body, it's in the breath. And I experienced this when I visited the secular Buddhist retreat. I experienced this when I'm with my children. I experienced this out in nature. Is this sort of slowing down and connecting with that which is around us. And that is where I have found the most meaning. And in fact, it has been through this journey of writing this book that I realized I didn't need God for that. I had it in abundance all around me.
But the G word really helps kind of create that blanket for a lot of people who attribute a lot of those kind of self, and so that's, to me, it's almost like idolatry, like that, giving all your powers of self introspection and your powers of relaxation, all these things, to something outside of yourself. And so you found this inside yourself. And so do you need to call it God? For you, obviously not.
Yeah, I think that was one of my sort of arguments in the book. Not that I, argue, but that if you read the book, you'll see that what I'm getting at is that for so long, because religion has been dominant, it has described human experience in its own terms, and yet it's human experience. And for me, these experiences of grace, of spirituality, of God, even the term God, are a very human experience that I have. And so if I can peel back the religious layer, the religious terminology, it gives me power to sort of embrace them in my way, on my terms, in secular terms.
Mm-hmm. And it also pulls you from kind of being under the thumb of the moral authority of an agent of some said religion that then, kind of is shepherding, and so there's a lot of that. There's been this real surge in New Age kind of rhetoric and spirituality, and all kinds of crazy stuff, from the aliens seeded us to all the conspiracies about who Krishna was and da 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 da. How much of this do you feel like is a counterculture in response to kind of the old world religions, and do you find it helpful?
So, I mean, some of what, yeah, I think the counterculture of the 60s, threw everything into tumult for good and bad. I think there was a lot that changed then. And then there was the backlash with the moral majority and now the religious right. And I think what you see, and I write about, so Robert Bellah was a sociologist who wrote in the 60s about something he called Sheilaism, which I thought was really an interesting term. He met a nurse named Sheila Larson, and he asked her about religion. He was studying religion. And she said, well, I do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I cultivate my own religion. I call it Sheilaism. And he said, okay, that's interesting. But, if we have, X hundreds of millions of people in this country, that means we have a potential for that many different religions. Are we all going to name it after ourselves? And so that's the real problem, is that how do you bring all of these seekers together? And I did see some answers to that. I went to this, at the Upaya Zen Center in New Mexico, a secular Buddhist retreat. And you think you're going to go to a meditation retreat and maybe you're going to find these sort of Sheilas or people who are just seeking out their own thing. These people are actually going to be trained in how to deal with human suffering because they worked in prisons and hospitals and hospice care. And so they were all out there trying to use these, ancient forms, meditation, the breath, all of this kind of work that people have been cultivating for so long, and to apply it in the modern day to help alleviate suffering. And I thought that was a perfect sort of use, I guess, of those practices, which can be used for simple personal attainment and bliss, which is fine. I mean, we all need to kind of get right with ourselves before we can help others. But I thought these people were actively then taking it out into the world. And I thought that was a great sort of almost step forward for that kind of world.
Yeah, and it seems a lot less sticky, right? So, there's this story that I was told when I was in Polynesia about how when the missionaries showed up, they basically, convinced that, there was this illness that came with them, and they convinced them that it was because their God was mad at them, and so, move down and, move away from the center where all your food is, and now, well, if you want food, you need money, and so it was this whole thing like, here, buy this book, right? Mm-hmm. And it created this real kind of crazy imperialism that came with religion. And so that has left its scar. And so, when good people of the world try to do good things, how do you have a unifying narrative without all of the kind of conquistador energy? And it sounds like you found a lot of these examples.
Yeah, I really did. I found these very people who really just want to share strong humanist values and do good in the world. And I think by removing God, that's created some trouble for them because it's harder to organize people. But it's also kept their sort of eyes on just straight ahead at the person sitting across from them. And so I think it's very powerful. I found a storytelling community in Oregon called The Hearth, and the guy who organizes it is actually he's a Christian minister, but it's not a religious deal. He says, I want to take the gems of religion and give them to all my non-religious friends who live in this town with me. And so he gets people together to tell their stories. And by doing so, it's sort of like the moth with a soul, it's like people telling these very vulnerable stories on stage. And he packs the house. They keep having to get a bigger and bigger venue. And he says, and when they leave after this night, my hope is they'll be more tender with one another when they see each other in the grocery store because they've shared a story about themselves. It's not a story about God. It's not a story about a miracle. It's a story about something I went through 30 years ago that I've never told anyone, and I'm going to tell you all here tonight. And suddenly it's just these human stories, this human relationship and interaction that is starting to sort of help bridge gaps across people in the community. And I just think those things were so hopeful when I saw those.
Were those people, did they feel like they were a community? I mean, when you leave there, do they feel like, I can't wait to go back, these are my people? Like all those things that religion provided on a Sunday?
Well, so it meets, this is interesting, it meets 4 times a year. So it's not constant, although we have smaller satellite meetings. But I will say this, I think the people that go to all 4, it's a quarterly thing. And they say this is sort of their profound religious, or not religious, spiritual experience. Like they go to this to be uplifted. And it's very hard these days if you don't go and sing in a church, or if you don't go and do some religious ritual in a synagogue. It's hard to have that collective feeling of ritual. And so what I think this gives them, and I do think it gives them some of that community, but I think it gives them more a sense of, I have these sort of regular moments throughout the year where I can have this collective ritual and feel really connected to people. And so it's a little bit different. And I could see in time, as it develops, it maybe would become something more regular. I know there are smaller groups that meet more regularly. But this is a group of like 400 people. And so I think that their sort of sense, what they take away from it is more of a sense of just a big ritual that you feel really good about when you leave the room.
So then what happens in the in-betweens? So you got a quarterly meeting where you are emoting and sharing and things are powerful and you're feeling human and connected. Is that enough? Or is there some sort of fabric that needs to be woven in between?
Well, so I think that one of the things that they do is they collect money. So each time they have these meetings, they take up a collection to give to a local community service, some kind of organization that's in need in that community. And so there's, I think, hope that people will see that and get more involved in their community. I think it's sort of, at this point, sending out these little fibers and hoping that people will take it from there. They don't have a physical place, so they meet in the synagogue. And one of the interesting things about that is a lot of the people from the synagogue come to see these storytellers. And a lot of the storytellers, the rabbi at the synagogue told me, have started to find their way back into Judaism because they sit in the synagogue and think, oh, I kind of miss some of this stuff. So I think what it's really about, it's a little bit of a more of a macro thing in that community, which is showing people we can share these spaces. We can share this space and we can sort of start to tear down some of the walls. And maybe just, on this night for sure, but maybe then out in your life, maybe you'll remember these stories. And as you hear, maybe you'll get up and share your story next time. And so I think there is this potential for it to grow outside of the event itself.
It reminds me of some of the early kind of religious history of Christianity and kind of the Zadokim of kind of the Jewish traditions, where you talk about like the time of Hypatia and Alexandria, and it makes me think, what did we have that bound society together and offered all of these areas where you go to the agora and you share and you connect with people, and all of this kind of got swept under the kind of meta narrative of these religions that said, no, we got this, and then over hundreds and if not thousands of years, the deterioration and whatever reasons the collapse of some of these religious institutions has brought, the parts that held society together that got swept in with that are now trying to find their way and try to get some oxygen because we need that.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because the religions that are in existence today are very finely honed machines. They are the survival of the fittest. They are the best. They wouldn't be here now if they weren't. And so they're really good at bringing people together. But more and more, I think, part of their draw was before we really had science to explain how the world came to be and give us, a real sort of the scientific method to explain how to understand things. I think it's harder and harder for people to buy that. And so people may want the community, but they go in and then the minister starts talking about scripture or some of those stories, and suddenly I think people just kind of check out and they detach. And so, yeah, what is it that's going to bring us back together as a community? I don't know the answer to that. I think it has to start at the local level. I think these grassroots organizations that I found are onto something, because they're meeting people's needs right now, and they're not waiting for someone to come and create this great, big, perfect thing. They're actually, when we lived in Boston, I took my kids regularly to community service events organized by the Humanist Hub. And that was great, because churches are really good at that. And so if I'm not going to attach to a church anymore to do that, am I just going to sit home and not have my kids do community service? So I think we have to work really hard to figure that out ourselves. I think it's the biggest question facing us.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I experienced and witnessed a fair amount of that on the road filming our last movie with just some of these organic farmers who basically had community around food and delivering food to people in need. It was all non-denominational, non-religious, but they played music and they shared, food and they cooked together. And it was beautiful. And it was something that, I was missing from my urban upbringing, just watching this. And so it's there. It's very humanist, right? And I don't know, I mean, religion used to fill a void. I don't know if the Big Bang has done anything for people in that capacity, right? And the rational capacity, absolutely. But the sense of being with people and breaking bread and sharing food, there are elements of this emerging everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. And I think people tell me not just the food, they miss the singing. They miss the collective singing and the rituals. So I know one group in Chicago that has a secular Shabbat dinner at their house. It's an open door deal. You don't have to be Jewish. They say one simple prayer and light a candle at the beginning, and it's a potluck, and everyone comes. And it's almost like this last vestige of the religion that's holding these groups together. So they've decided this is our sacred. This Friday night dinner with our friends is sacred, and we're going to do it. And so I think what we have to decide is what is going to be sacred enough to us that we will it will trump our personal desires and wishes in the moment. Because I think a lot of us are out trying to sort of curate our time and our experience to such an idiosyncratic degree that it's hard to make time for one another. And so I think that's something that religion has always been so good at. Just drop everything and come. This is when we meet. And, if you don't show up, you're not really one of us. And so how do we do that without sort of a God commanding us to do that?
Is it any different without that kind of wraparound meta narrative of saying we're doing this with God? I mean, are these people having a good time? Are they moral? Are they upright citizens?
Right. Yeah. I mean, yes. So, if we use the secular Shabbat example, they have these strong values, and they obviously care about one another and want to do good in the world. And they figured out a way to make everyone come together. I think in our modern busy age, that's the struggle, is getting people to drop everything and say, this is it. I mean, I think it happens, maybe for a funeral it happens, but, when do we really drop everything? Mostly we do it for our kids' soccer games. That's not quite the same.
And that's a community. I mean, it seems like, that's the one thing, as a parent, you want some sort of binding community for your kids. And is that kind of one of the biggest things that sounds like you were missing at that moment with the procession, right? And so what have you found? I mean, are you now sharing these communities with your kids? Or are you giving them different places to have outlets?
So the thing about sports, because I really toyed with that, could basketball be my son's religion? And what I realized was the problem with that is it's so temporal. Like these kids move on, these families move on, the years go by, and then before you know it, the basketball league you were in is disbanded. I mean, it doesn't last often more than a season or two. So that really wasn't working. While I was writing the book, we moved to Chicago, and we ended up in a neighborhood that my husband grew up in. And it was the first time I really felt that I live in a place where I have these connections through time. His relatives are no longer living, but his grandparents and his parents lived mere blocks from where we live right now. And we see their friends all the time. They're just around. They sort of have this sort of institutional knowledge of our family and of this neighborhood and of things that happen there. And so for us, the connection has come through these neighborhood connections and for being in a place where there's this strong history. And other people are going to have to, I guess we find it all in our own different ways. I think the people that meet for the secular Shabbat in Chicago, that's how they're finding it. That's how that family has decided they wanted those connections. Some people join Unitarian Universalist Church, or go to secular humanism. So there's all these ways, but I think first comes the awareness that there is something that you might be missing. And then if so, okay, let's look around and see where can we find these connections with like-minded people.
What's interesting is we have the same dilemma in medicine is most people are trained to ask or say, tell me the answer. What is it? What is the answer? Like, I'm listening to you talking about this, and you're giving me choices. You're telling me, I should look at things, and I should consider things, and just tell me the answer, which is kind of the way religion used to roll. Right? And so although we're even, many people are moving away from religion, that tendency to try to find one unifying answer to all things without exploring and discovering and questioning and really kind of pondering things on our own, I find to be missing in medicine. And I'm kind of hearing a lot of that echoed in your kind of exploration of this non-religious new terrain that we've kind of stumbled into.
Yeah, and I come to the conclusion at the book, I come back around, my son had asked me this question, what are we? And I come to the conclusion there is no one answer for what we are. And just recently, our daughter told me, well, I'm part Jewish, part Christian, and part gymnastics. And so I feel like her answer is that there's a lot of answers. There's a lot of answers. And I think, a lot of it is just constantly questioning. And so the final part of the book is a letter I write to my children where I say, look, I don't have all the answers, but these are some things that I believe and value, and I hope you'll use these as a stepping stone on your own journey. I honestly, my hope as a parent is that they would come up with 10 different, I have 10 things listed in the epilogue, that they would come up with 10 different things when they're my age, because they will be continuing to question.
I love that. And that's a big part of where all of us need to go in this conversation is how do we coexist? How do we live together? What's morality? What's ethics? Who are we in the grand scheme of things? And how do we, look, the 10 Commandments, they were kind of cool. Like, don't hurt the guy next door. Don't steal. Don't be a jerk. There's certain things I think we could all maybe agree on. And that discovery is a really powerful piece that you've now given, kind of the authority for your kids to kind of find and unearth on their own. And it's a hard way to parent because it's a lot easier to say this is the answer. And then they might end up where you were at with their children down the line because it's just a presupposition and you take it as truth. It's what's truth.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, listen, I think this is great. I think that you've opened up a very powerful conversation, and we need to stay on this. Like we need to kind of lean into this as a culture. People are blowing themselves up in the name of God all over the place, and so we realize that script has gotten really noisy. And instead of kind of insulating and burying in and entrenching and saying my way, my God, your God, da 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 da, it's time to start talking about this and figuring figuring out what an answer can be that can help us coexist without a narrative that's so polarizing. So the book is fascinating. I think that you've really opened up a lot of interesting dialogue here. I actually don't have it in studio here, but if you could flash it for my audience here.
Here it is. Can you see it?
Yeah, Grace Without God, and Catherine, Osment.
That's right. Yeah.
And I applaud you for doing this kind of work. It must have been a very interesting 3-4 year journey for you. And
it was great. Thank you so much. It was truly life-changing. It really gave me a deeper sense of meaning and purpose in my life.
And I have to say something. If you're listening to this right now, or watching this right now, and you're thinking, okay, that's really interesting, but that conflicts with my belief system because I identify as a Christian and I need to... Just read a book, right? And just start opening up to a dialogue that can help you think about maybe your relationship with Christianity. Maybe it makes you a better Christian, but the point is, leverage. She spent 3-4 years of her life studying and looking at this and bringing back stories for us to help us understand this narrative better. And so instead of kind of entrenching further and saying, well, that's against my beliefs, let's just start looking at how we can coexist together. And no one's asking you to lay God down. It's just time to start thinking about how we interact with religion and maybe find a way to stop killing each other and find happiness in our own lives, huh?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah,
agreed completely.
Hey, thank you so much for being on the show. This is great.
Thank you for having me.
Hope you enjoyed it. This is a conversation that's not going anywhere, and this is something we all need to get into about our global morality and what that looks like in a world that is now seemingly distancing itself from the G word. Well, there's a lot of things in there that would be appropriate to keep, and there's a lot of people who absolutely believe in God. So now how do you interface with a new majority? So it's going to be interesting times. I'd love to hear in the chat threads what you thought about this episode. Next week, Maya Salvitz, we're talking about addiction. We're talking about a very new way of looking at addiction, so don't miss that. I got some previous episodes here if you want to click on it if you're watching the video. Of course, you could always subscribe. I love what I'm doing. I hope you're enjoying it. I'll see you next week.